presentation of our virtual Triangle SciTech Expo. My name is Greg Scupian. I'm so glad to be with you this afternoon, and I have the pleasure of kicking off this week's excellent slate of presentations. And today we're joined with Skelly Hunt and Adam Bloom. They are two of our great AmeriCorps members at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. A couple things before we get started. First of all, we couldn't do this without our sponsors. So thank you very much to the North Carolina SciFest, as well as the Biogen Foundation for sponsoring this week's slate of programs. For those of you joining us on Zoom, closed captionings are available if you'd like them. All you have to do is click on the CC button there at the bottom of your screen and click on Show Subtitles. For optimal viewing, we recommend using the side-by-side mode. You can access that by clicking at the top of your screen where it says View Options and selecting side-by-side mode. That will allow you to see our speaker and their slides at the same time. And of course, we're going to be really active in that chat. We ask that you put all your questions and comments in there. But of course, let's be good digital citizens. We've all been doing this for the past year. Let's be kind and respectful in that chat. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker. Skelly Hunt is the AmeriCorps member with events here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And both Skelly and Adam are going to be talking about unexpected discoveries, outside the box thinking in science. Take it away, Skelly.
Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate that introduction. As Greg said, Adam and I are both really appreciate you all taking this Monday lunch hour to join us and kick off the SciTech Expo. This program is all about some unusual scientific discoveries. So these are discoveries or inventions that Adam and I thought were really interesting and we just wanted to share with you. So first of all, I want to address how do scientific discoveries even come about? So scientists, as you may know, use something called the scientific method to make discoveries. And almost every advance in medicine, engineering, any sort of technology has come from scientists working through these steps of the scientific method one by one. First of all, we start with an observation of some phenomenon in the natural world, or maybe with a question about how or why something happens. And after we have that question, the next step is research. And then hopefully we're able to come up with a hypothesis that explains our original observation or question. And scientists spend a lot of their time designing experiments to test hypotheses, and even more time poring over the results of these experiments and then wrapping it all up in a nice conclusion that answers the original question. The scientific method leads us in a full circle, and it lets us answer almost any question about the natural world, given enough time, application, and patience. So as an example of a textbook use of the scientific method, before we get into the really crazy wild science, let's look at something that happened in 1749, the discovery of vaccinations by Edward Jenner. In 1749, smallpox was a deadly disease that occurred in humans. It killed about 30% of those who were infected. And Jenner spoke with a dairymaid who told him, "I shall never have smallpox, for I have had cowpox." And cowpox was a relatively mild illness in cattle that could be spread to humans, but didn't really have any symptoms. So Jenner was thinking about this and observing that people who had cowpox believed they wouldn't get smallpox, and he interviewed a lot more dairy workers and found that they almost all believed that this was true. So his hypothesis here was, if a person is inflicted with cowpox, that person will not become ill after exposure to smallpox. And he designed an experiment to test this. So he scratched some material from a cowpox sore on the hand of his milkmaid onto the arm of a willing volunteer, the 8-year-old James Phipps, the son of Jenner's gardener. So he wasn't willing to test it on himself, but he was willing to test it on the son of his gardener. So young James Phipps felt poorly for a couple days after his infection with cowpox, but then he made a full recovery. So a short time later, Jenner continued the experiment and scratched some matter from a fresh human smallpox sore onto James's arm. in an attempt to make him ill with smallpox. James did not get smallpox, and Jenner went on to test this idea on a lot of other humans and then published a report of his findings. So that's the scientific method in a nutshell right there. In contrast, is my next slide showing up?
I'm still seeing the discovery of vaccines. There we go.
Happy. All right, thank you. So in contrast, another of the greatest medical breakthroughs of our time is the discovery of penicillin, which was a result of a total accident. And the man pictured here, Alexander Fleming, was notorious for keeping a really messy laboratory. So it wasn't really surprising when he returned from a 2-week vacation and there was a fungus growing on some of his bacterial culture plates. And that's when he noticed that wherever the fungus was growing, bacteria was not growing. And this fungus turned out to be from the genus Penicillium. And Alexander Fleming was able to isolate the compound responsible and ended up inventing penicillin, an incredibly powerful antibiotic drug. So we have two examples here, one of a highly focused investigation by Jenner that produced a discovery that really changed the world, and one that was an accident that led to a discovery that was just as important. So on the one hand, we have Jenner, who was focused on understanding a specific topic, spent a lot of time and effort gathering and analyzing data. And then on the other hand, we have a scientific discovery by Fleming that seems almost accidental. He was trying to learn something else entirely, and he stumbled upon penicillin. So this second type of discovery isn't truly a random accident, but in fact, it requires a very particular mind that has been prepared to notice and understand the importance of what they see to understand and expound upon the accidental result. So in addition, the accidental discovery has to be followed up on with a lot of testing and experimentation to validate the result. So it's possible that the discoverer has been marinating in data for years and years, and suddenly they have this bathtub eureka moment as their subconscious thought finally picks up on a non-obvious pattern, something that appears as if the idea came out of nowhere, but really it's a result of a lot of thought and study. I really like this quote by William Welley here, a philosopher of science. It says, "It is, as I have elsewhere said, only the spark which discharges a gun already loaded and pointed, and there's little propriety in speaking of such an accident as the cause why the bullet hits the mark." So now that we've discussed the scientific method a little bit and looked at some case studies of scientific method applied versus these accidental discoveries, I want to share some really cool unexpected discoveries from recent times. So the first discovery I want to share has to do with vision. As you may know already, the human eye, which provides our vision, is filled with rods and cones. And in our eyes, we have different types of cone cells that allow us to perceive different colors on the spectrum, ranging from 400 nanometers all the way up to 700, as depicted in this diagram. There is radiation outside those bounds called ultraviolet on the low end and infrared on the high end, and humans can't see those. Although there are some animals such as vipers and some types of fish that can see infrared light. We often refer to infrared vision as thermal vision, since infrared emissions are directly related to the temperature of the object. This is a thermal image of some deer in a field. You can see that those bodies are emitting heat compared to the cooler background, and so you're able actually to see living organisms in complete darkness. So scientists at a lab at the University of Science and Technology in China were trying to replicate this thermal vision, and they injected the eyes of mice with nanoparticles that latch onto rods and cones. And these nanoparticles increase the sensitivity of the rods and cones and allow them to capture infrared wavelengths that would normally not be picked up by rods and cones at all. And mice with the injections were able to detect infrared light, and they were able to navigate using that heat vision for several weeks after the experiment, and there were no lasting side effects. So kind of turning the tables on vipers. Maybe in the future we'll have mice that have infrared vision as well. All right. The second outside the box science I'd like to share with you shifts from vision to another sense, hearing. Scientists at MIT have recently described a technique to restore hearing through hair growth. Unfortunately for Darwin here, the hair growth they're talking about isn't head hair, but inner ear sensory cells called hair cells. The picture of the weird seaweed looking stuff on the right here is actually a microscopic image of what is called a hair cell inside an ear. Inside our ear, vibrations from sounds outside cause our hair cells inside to move, which then create an electrical impulse that our brain translates into our perception of sound. And these hair cells are very fragile and they're actually damaged by loud noises and they do not regenerate in humans. And since humans are only born with about 15,000 of these hair cells, which die off over time, hearing degrades over time, as you all know. Birds and amphibians are capable of regenerating these hair cells, and that inspired the scientist at MIT to develop a drug that stimulates hair cell growth, and it actually successfully generated new hair cells inside the cochlea. All right, moving on. This next discovery is about methane emissions from cows, and I was wondering if the chat can guess what the scientists ended up feeding the cows that worked and reduced methane. If you want to throw your answers in the chat there while we talk about how cows produce methane, and we'll circle around and see what kind of ideas you guys had. So these scientists have been experimenting with feeding cows all sorts of different things, trying to reduce the amount of methane in their burps. Cows generate methane in two main ways, through their digestion and through their waste. So cows, along with sheep, goats, giraffes, are all part of a group of animals called ruminants. And ruminants have stomachs with 4 distinct chambers. And in the first chamber, called the rumen, there's a really complex ecosystem of bacteria, protozoa, even some funguses. And these microorganisms break down the sugar and starch from the plants. And then other ones break down the cellulose that makes up the plant cell walls. And in this process called enteric fermentation in the rumen, the bacteria break down all these complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. And one of the end products of this fermentation are gases such as carbon dioxide and methane. So yeah, I see in the chat, we have some correct answers. Seaweed is actually what the scientists figured out reduces methane. So at UC Berkeley, they discovered that just a few ounces of seaweed a day reduce methane emissions by over 80%. And of course, an important part of the scientific method is, can you replicate this experiment? So scientists in Australia attempted to replicate the results, and they found that they could cut the methane emissions from cows by 99% just by replacing the cow's diet with a 3% seaweed. So there are years of research and development ahead, and so we can figure out the best seaweed for mass production and methane reduction. So this diagram shows the seaweed-based industry steps on the top and the cattle industry steps on the bottom. So they have to figure out which species are best for cultivation in oceans or tanks, and figure out the best way to process that seaweed, and then do animal trials where you see how is the animal affected? Is the beef that is produced safe for human consumption, et cetera, et cetera. And then as far as moving it to industrial scale, we have to establish seaweed farms. We have to figure out how to process them and distribute them. And on the right, we have the ecological implications. So first of all, seaweed farming is actually beneficial for the ocean because it reduces ocean acidification. We're going to have a talk later on this week about ocean acidification if you want to learn more about that. But it's essentially a result of sequestering carbon in seaweed instead of dissolved in the water. And of course, just as trees on land improve air quality, seaweed in the water can improve water quality by filtering out contaminants. And feeding the cow seaweed ends up reducing methane emissions. So why do we care about the methane or the gas that a cow is burping out? So this yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We had a question from Paula. She wants to know, how exactly does the seaweed work? what's it doing inside the cow that reduces methane?
That's a great question. So it all comes back to what's happening in this rumen, and the seaweed is changing that enteric fermentation in the process, and it's binding the carbon dioxide, and it's not being emitted as carbon dioxide or methane. So it changes the gut microbiome of the gut here and produces less methane. It just it kind of slightly alters the chemical process that happens. So the pie chart here, as it was saying, is a breakdown of all the greenhouse gases that are released into the atmosphere from human activity. So that big blue one is carbon dioxide, the pretty small red wedge is methane. But unfortunately, methane, even though it's relatively uncommon compared to carbon dioxide, it traps about 30 times more heat. So this means that that small red wedge on the pie chart actually ends up trapping 6 times as much heat as the large blue wedge on the chart. So this is why scientists were interested in reducing methane emissions from cows, because 40% of all atmospheric methane comes from agriculture. So even though reducing the amount of methane from cows is a good step towards reducing greenhouse gases from agriculture, the big picture is that agriculture actually plays a relatively small part in our overall greenhouse gas emissions. This pie chart shows from the EPA shows that agriculture is just 10% of US greenhouse gas emissions. And sectors like transportation, electricity generation, and industry, like factory production, are actually the largest contributors. So we need a lot more of this out of the box thinking in different fields to solve climate change. So if you can think of a way to run cars and generate electricity with seaweed, scientists at UC Berkeley definitely want to talk to you. This diagram shows the global carbon cycle. So on the right, we have a blue arrow labeled respiration, and that represents all the carbon dioxide that humans and other animals are breathing out all the time. And on the other side of that is the green arrow, photosynthesis. Plants are taking in carbon dioxide all the time. Meanwhile, over on the left, the ocean is constantly cycling carbon, and it actually acts as a storage for carbon dioxide to a certain point. And then the orange arrows going up show the effects of burning fossil fuels and land use changes, which could be deforestation. So you have less photosynthesis happening. Both of these things end up putting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So at this point in time, we're reducing methane emissions by cool stuff like feeding cows seaweed. We're trying to cut our carbon dioxide emissions, but we actually already have probably way too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for a healthy planet. So even if we're able to cut our emissions down significantly, there's still too much in the atmosphere. So scientists are actually working on ways to remove carbon dioxide from the air. And I'd like to ask the chat if you have any ideas for ways we might be able to remove carbon dioxide. Looking at this global carbon cycle diagram might give you some ideas, and you can just throw those in the chat if you can think of anything we can do. And there's a lot of possibilities here. So planting more trees is always an option that is tried and tested and true, but we're actually limited by how much land there is available for trees. Plus, eventually they fall down or get cut down or burned and decompose, and that carbon dioxide is back into the atmosphere. So planting a ton of trees is not really a long-term solution. We can't cover the entire Earth in trees. So I'd like to turn it over to Adam here to discuss some of these methods of carbon sequestration. And if you guys have any, oh, we have an idea, bicycle more. Yeah, definitely, that's a big one. Transportation, cut down on transportation. So Adam, I'm gonna go and hand it over to you. If you can talk about a little bit about carbon.
Awesome, that sounds great. I'll go ahead and share my presentation. All right, thank you so much for that segue, Skelly. So I'm going to keep it going and talk about two more outside the box kind of strategies and technologies, and particularly two strategies and how we can help reduce those greenhouse gas emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So I'm going to start by going over a quick, here, I'll get this going, Going over a quick background on the greenhouse effect, Skelly did a great job kind of introducing this topic, but I'll do a little bit more just to kind of give us all an equal playing field. So greenhouse gases are emitted from human activities, including electricity production, transportation, food production, other industry activities. And the way greenhouse gases impact the environment is they make the atmosphere thicker. And so when radiation from the sun is able to enter the earth, it has a more difficult time leaving the earth. And therefore there's an overall warming trend. So 81.3% of US greenhouse gases in 2018 were carbon dioxide. So the industries that are producing these greenhouse gases, 81% of the gases released were carbon dioxide. And so like Skelly mentioned, a huge piece of research is going to be finding ways to take this carbon dioxide out of the air and putting it somewhere else or sequestering it. And so we're going to talk about two really outside of the box ideas and strategies to do this. So a lot of the ideas that we've had so far in addressing the issue of climate change has been centered around reducing our emissions. They're really inside the box thinking, but they're really effective strategies. Like someone mentioned in the chat, we can bicycle more, we can try to reduce the amount of time that we're driving, carpool more. But at this point, like Skelly mentioned, we've put enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that it's time to think about some outside of the box options, in addition to these really important inside the box options too. So I'm going to be talking about two outside of the box strategies today in ocean fertilization and carbon recycling. So ocean fertilization is where we're going to start today, and it's a super controversial strategy in taking carbon emissions and sequestering them. So while I'm explaining about it, I want you all to listen close and in the chat, post what you think. Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it's not such a good idea? And we're going to regroup after I explain kind of what it is. And I'm super curious to hear what all of you think about ocean fertilization and whether it's a viable strategy, maybe needs a little more development, or if you think it's no good. So without further ado, we're going to start talking about ocean fertilization and what that means. So inside the ocean, there are these things called phytoplankton, and phytoplankton work a lot like trees in that they are able to take light energy from the sun and transform it into chemical energy that's usable by the rest of the food chain. But these, kind of like how plants and trees need water, they need sunlight to grow, they need carbon dioxide, these phytoplankton have a certain set of needs that they have to be able to flourish and to be able to do really well in the ocean. So like I mentioned, they need to be in the top part of the ocean so that they can get that sunlight, but they also need to have that carbon dioxide, which is really helpful for us because it takes that carbon dioxide out of the air and into the ocean and then sequesters it when they fall down to the ocean floor. But they also need some really important nutrients, and those are kind of the limiting factor for a lot of these phytoplankton. So one nutrient that is really limiting and really important for the success of these phytoplankton is iron. And so the idea behind ocean fertilization is actually dumping iron into the ocean so that these phytoplankton are no longer limited by this nutrient. What happens then is in these really unproductive parts of the ocean where there's not a lot of phytoplankton success, the phytoplankton, now that they have that nutrient that they really need, they're able to flourish and they're able to be much more productive in taking carbon dioxide and sequestering it. So the idea between ocean fertilization is adding this iron to the ocean, and then that way, by flourishing and increasing this primary production, it's almost like planting more trees. You're able to sequester carbon into these animals, add it back to the food chain, and some will fall to the ocean floor and kind of get sequestered underneath and taken out of the carbon cycle. And it's also really interesting because it kind of adds a little spark to the food chain. You're able to add a lot of primary production at the lower level, which is going to boost zooplankton, which is the planktons that eat these phytoplanktons. And then it's just going to kind of have a steady increase in the amount of food that's available to each stage of the food web. So that's kind of the overview of ocean fertilization. In a second, I'm going to say a little bit about what I think and what other scientists think, but I'd love to hear if there's any ideas in the chat, if people are having either positive reactions or maybe negative reactions to some problems that could go on about this. Anything in the chat, Greg?
I'm not seeing anything, but
Not seeing anything?
I'm personally skeptical about this idea.
You're a little skeptical.
Yeah, why don't you tell us some more?
Yeah, I'll definitely tell you a little more. During the practice last week, I mentioned this to a lot of the people at the museum, and I think from a natural sciences background, it's definitely a little scary to be dumping things and almost polluting the ocean. So there's definitely a lot of room for skepticism here. I'm going to start by highlighting the two pros that I mentioned. So it has the potential to increase the primary production in and decrease carbon dioxide concentrations in the air. So when you increase primary productivity in the ocean, you're able to decrease the amount of dissolved carbon dioxide, which is going to drive the reaction. Then more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is going to be dissolved in the oceans and taken out of the atmosphere, which is going to reduce the greenhouse gas effect. So that's one really huge benefit of this system. Another really cool benefit is that it increases primary productivity in the less productive areas of the ocean. So a lot of areas are nutrient limited in the ocean. And so this is enabling those areas to kind of have a more rich baseline of primary production that can kind of work its way through the rest of the food chain. So those are some of the really interesting benefits in this system. There are a lot of negatives that a lot of scientists are highlighting. It can have huge impacts on the rest of the marine environment. And it's also super difficult to isolate to a specific part of the ocean. The ocean is super fluid, and so it's hard to say, I'm going to dump iron only in this part. It can have really big impacts in the rest of the ocean, and it can have really negative impacts if it moves to a part of the ocean where it causes toxic algae to bloom, or if it kind of shifts the food web in a way that you don't want it to. Also, this is really interesting, which is a huge kind of point in the negative column. At the tested amounts of iron, the results are kind of inconclusive on how much net carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere. One big reason of this is that the tested amounts of iron that's been dumped into the ocean are pretty low concentrations because they don't want to make a big mistake and dump a ton of iron and then it's a disaster. And so models are saying that larger amounts of iron would likely have a larger net carbon dioxide removal. But it is a little bit scary to see that at the tested amounts of iron, it's inconclusive on how much carbon dioxide is going to be net taken out of the atmosphere. And then lastly, it can lead to the production of some other gases like nitrous oxide, which actually has a more potent greenhouse effect than carbon dioxide. So there's definitely some risks here. My kind of concluding thoughts are that I think it's really interesting and a really innovative approach, and it's a cool approach to work with nature to help address some of the man-made problems and also boost the primary productivity in some parts of the ocean where there's low primary productivity. So I think research is really important, and I think determining the location is really important so that you're really helping these primary producers flourish, but you're not causing the flourishing of any toxic algae or anything else. I also think scientific cooperation is really important here. In 2012, there was an iron dump tested in the Pacific Ocean, and the scientific community was not very aware that this was going on, and there was a lot of frustration that this iron dump occurred. And so I think that because the oceans are shared among so many different countries and impact so many different communities, I think it's really important that the research, the development of plans is taken a really cooperative approach. So that's kind of my conclusions here. I'd love to know if there's any questions about iron fertilization in the chat. This is the perfect time.
We got a couple. So Paula was wondering if iron is going to influence other chemical processes in the ocean.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, so we know that dissolved carbon dioxide can change the pH of the ocean, which has really big impacts on the marine environment. So I'm certain that adding a molecule kind of like iron could easily have certain impacts in the ocean chemistry, which is another really important thing here to consider. So that's a really good point. I think that's one of the fears of scientists. What if it has some of these negative impacts? I will say that the iron, so they're usually adding iron sulfide. And actually on the left, we have a photo it's a NASA satellite photo of an iron tested dump. And so you can see kind of the iron running through the ocean, which is really interesting. But one thing I should note about the iron dumping, the iron is an element that is naturally occurring in the ocean. And so it's circulated and really prevalent in certain parts of our oceans. And so it's not adding necessarily a foreign component to the ocean because iron is a really important part of the ocean's chemistry already. But it is really definitely worth considering whether or not adding additional iron could change the ocean chemistry. So that's a great question.
Then we had one more. So you kind of mentioned already that dumping iron into the ocean may change the food web, but Chad was wondering if it would directly hurt any animals in the ocean.
That's a really good question. What the arguments in favor and kind of the way I see it, and I think asking a biologist this would be a really interesting talk. But the way I see it, you're kind of, instead of boosting For example, like instead of boosting something that would help a shark, and then the shark population gets really high, and then they're able to kind of frenzy on the fish, and then you have no fish. This wouldn't be that kind of problem because you're boosting it from the bottom up. And so in theory, by boosting from the bottom up, more food would be available to the entire food web. With that being said, I'm sure certain species would benefit more than others. And then you could have some of those problems where certain fish or other marine animals are able to flourish. And because they're flourishing, they're going to dwindle the populations of other marine animals. So I think it could definitely have some negative impacts on the food web, but it also could have really positive impacts on the food web and increase biodiversity. So it's kind of hard to know without seeing it happen.
Thanks, Adam. And it looks like we have one more question from Frederick.
Perfect.
What form of iron is required for the process?
Excellent question. So usually it's going to be in an aqueous form. So it's going to be like an iron sulfide, so that it can really dissolve as quickly as possible into the marine environment, so that it doesn't leave these huge stains sitting in the ocean for years to come. It's a really good question. Awesome. Without further ado, we're going to slide to a little bit less controversial issue, but a really interesting piece of technology that is an awesome way that scientists are thinking outside of the box in order to take a lot of these greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and try to do something productive with them. So carbon recycling involves taking carbon dioxide and transforming it into usable fuels. Some of these fuels can include liquid ethanol, liquid propanol, liquid methanol, or even using a fuel source of hydrogen in order to power cars, power other pieces of technology, or power industry. So it's kind of taking this negative situation that are these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and recycling those gases and using them in a way that's productive. So I'm going to be talking about one particular carbon recycling process in which carbon dioxide as a gas is transformed into liquid methanol. And I think this is super cool. I studied chemistry as an undergraduate at UNC, so I'm really kind of a nerd about the whole chemistry reaction here. So I'm going to quickly talk about that. So the way this works is it's actually it's a photovoltaic cell is going to absorb the sunlight from the sun, and it's going to use that energy to power a redox reaction. So the way this is going to work, as you can see, carbon dioxide is going to be put in this process and known as the electrolysis, and it's going to be reduced. And when it's reduced, the carbon dioxide is going to gain an electron. It's going to look like a more hydrogen-rich product. And so you can use waste that's really rich in hydrogen, kind of add that hydrogen to the molecule and add that electron on. And the resulting product is going to be this hydrocarbon fuel that's going to eventually be distilled and produced into liquid methanol, which I think is so cool that you're taking this gas, and not only are you able to sequester the gas, but you're able to turn it into something liquid. So it changed from a gas to a liquid, and now it turns into methanol, which can be used as biofuel, which can power methanol cars. It can be used in production. So it's a really cool way to kind of take this potentially valuable product. So one really important thing that I'm going to mention, carbon capture is another kind of interesting field and is really connected to carbon recycling, because the technologies used to kind of take that carbon outside of the atmosphere and put it into these processes there's a lot of really cool technologies there. The case study that we're going to talk about in a second, the system that they use, they are capping the industry sites. So the greenhouse gas producers I mentioned before, where they're producing food or they're producing other types of industrial things, they're going to cap those and send the pure carbon dioxide directly to a carbon recycling plant. So we're going to watch a really quick video that's going to show a case study in carbon recycling that happened in Iceland. It's a company in Iceland that's doing this carbon recycling and seeing really good results. So we're going to quickly watch this video.
Adam, is there supposed to be sound because we're not
There
hearing?
is. I might here. Let me quickly here. I'll quickly reshare with sound. Sorry about that. I was worried about that. Here we go. I'm so sorry about that. There we go. And just like that, we are back live. All right. We'll start that over. It's only missed a second.
Human
that better?
activities result in 100 million
Perfect.
tons of CO2 being released into the atmosphere each day. To avert the most serious effects of climate change, carbon emissions need to be drastically reduced in the coming years. Many everyday products contain carbon and are currently made using fossil resources. What if we could use renewable energy and recycle carbon to create a more sustainable alternative? The way to achieve this is to capture and reuse CO2 that's otherwise being emitted into the atmosphere. Carbon Recycling International, CRI, developed the emissions to liquids technology to transform industrial carbon emissions and renewable energy into a liquid product, methanol. A single plant, such as the one seen here, can repurpose 150,000 tons of CO2 every year. This is equivalent to taking 53,000 cars permanently off the road. Here's how this works. The first step in the process is to extract CO2 from an industrial emission source by using a carbon capture system so that it can be used as a raw material. The other raw material needed is hydrogen. Renewable electricity is used to generate hydrogen by splitting water in a process known as electrolysis. Oxygen is formed as a byproduct. Hydrogen and CO2 gases are then combined, compressed, and converted to renewable methanol in a catalytic reactor. The produced liquid methanol is further purified by distillation. The process is uniquely flexible and able to adjust its operation to accommodate variable renewable energy, effectively storing it as liquid. Following distillation, the renewable methanol is ready to be delivered to the end users. Its main applications are as a clean-burning fuel and as a chemical building block for products such as adhesives, foams, and plastics. By using CO2 as a resource for fuel and chemical production, CRI's emissions to liquids technology transforms industrial value chains from linear to circular, growing our industry and powering societies without harming the environment. Learn more about CRI and the Circle Energy Project on our website, cri.is.
Awesome. So yeah, I think this is just it's such a cool piece of technology that's able to take carbon dioxide out of the air and make this really usable and practical product in methanol. So I think it's just the coolest thing, and I think it's such an interesting way that outside of the box technologies are being used to reduce our carbon footprint. All right, and so one last thing, I can't talk about outside of the box thinking and clean technology without shouting out our neighbors in the triangle. The triangle area is a super innovative and super interesting area in clean technology. And so there's a lot of these really cool things, kind of like what we talked about today, happening right around the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. We have the Research Triangle Clean Tech Cluster, which is this really innovative collaborative group between these companies, between government, between nonprofits, that's really promoting the development of clean technology in the area. And as a result, we have some of the highest density of clean tech companies in the country, including the 10 companies I have listed here. So we live in a really innovative way where in a really innovative area where outside of the box thinking is continue to be used to address some of these problems. With that being said, if there's any questions at this time, either for my two strategies or for anything that Skelly covered, please dump your questions right in the chat and we'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Skelly, as well. Yeah, I find that all of it very incredibly interesting and novel. Earlier in the chat, Paige had mentioned how her fiance works at a tree company, and for every tree they cut down, they have to plant 2 more.
That's so cool.
In the past, like that was the solution, was to plant more trees. But it seems like to solve the climate change problem, we may need a different type of plant, like this carbon recycling plant. So all these things seem like way above my head, right? I don't have a degree in chemistry or technology. What could me as an average person living in Raleigh do to help fight some of these problems?
That's an awesome question. So I think kind of like what people mentioned, it's still really important to monitor your own carbon footprint. And it's super important to be aware of the carbon emissions that you might be responsible for. So whether that's biking to work or making sure all the lights are off, as anybody can really play a big role in the global carbon kind of balance by really curbing your own emissions. And then also talking to your local government and seeing, or your local utilities provider to see, hey, where is my energy coming from? Is my energy coming from a coal plant? Is my energy kind of mixed in with renewables? And kind of see how you as a local and individual person can kind of mix in as much clean technology as possible into your own life.
That's great. It looks like Galley's shared a link as well.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Without clicking on that link, I bet maybe it says something about reducing your red meat consumption.
Oh, I'm sure.
Plant-based diet is big. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do in our personal lives, but it's important to remember that there's like 100 corporations that are doing a majority of the carbon emissions.
Sure. Let's see. There were a few questions in the chat. The first one comes from Frederick. He was wondering about the, again, that chemical process is happening inside the cows. And he says the end product is going to be H2. Does that mean we're going to have floating cows or exploding cows as that gas expands? And
That's a good question. That's going to be part of the next steps in researching, the safety for the animals eating the seaweed. But what they found so far is that the cows that were eating seaweed were still healthy and they were gaining weight at the same rate as cows without the seaweed. So that's what we know so far, but there will be a lot more research into, is this safe for cows? Is it safe to eat meat from those cows or dairy from those cows that are fed seaweed? What are the changes in flavor, etc.?
Thanks, Kelly. And then one more question for Adam. Again, from Frederick, was wondering if all that iron in the ocean, will it become rust at some point?
So I think because it's added to the ocean in the form of iron sulfide, it's a more aqueous form of iron. So I think it's not going to be like the kind of iron that we see that kind of gets all rusty and yeah. So I don't think it would turn into rust, unlike some of the iron that we see that the oxygen reacts with it and turns it into rust.
Thanks. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions from the chat. So I guess we'll say thank you, guys. This was very eye-opening. Certainly great examples of thinking outside the box to solve some of the world's largest problems. I certainly learned something new, and I hope everybody watching at home did as well. If you'd like to learn more interesting new things about science and technology, we have a whole week of lectures just like these. We're to drop the link to that schedule in the chat. Please join us. We got one coming up here at 1, and then a couple more later today. So join us, come learn more about science and technology. Thanks, everybody.